The rain hit Highway 24 like it had a grievance. Not weather, something deliberate. Sheets of it sideways, the kind that makes headlights useless and good decisions feel optional. Somewhere above Silver Ridge, Colorado, a truck was doing 40 in what should have been a 60 zone. And the man behind the wheel was thinking about lumber costs and a birthday dinner he was already 3 hours late for. He wasn't thinking about her. Until she was there, St. Elaine, standing, barefoot on wet asphalt in October, facing that stuff to avoid with fire you face from those charging not to run from. No fear, no flinch. Just those eyes, pale as winter sky, looking through tons of moving metal like it was a question she'd already answered. The truck stopped 4 feet from her. She didn't move. And somewhere in Denver, a phone was about to ring in an office where a woman with silver hair and a smile that never reached her eyes had been waiting, very patiently, for exactly this moment. The rain had been falling since noon. By 9:47, it wasn't rain anymore. It was something meaner, something personal. The kind of storm that made Highway 24 feel like the bottom of a river, and Mark Anderson was driving through it. Because he had no choice, because the Delgado project ran 3 hours over, because the foreman on the Denver site couldn't read a structural spec if his retirement depended on it, and because Sandra's birthday dinner had started at 6, and it was now nearly 10, and he hadn't called. He knew he should have called. He hadn't called. The wipers were losing. That was the honest truth of it. 2 rubber blades fighting a losing war against water that fell sideways. Water that fell upwards somehow. Water that found the one small gap at the top of his driver side window and dripped onto his left shoulder in a cold, steady rhythm that matched his guilt almost perfectly. 1 drop. Pause. Another drop. Right, you should have called. 37 years old. 2 tours as a combat engineer. Rebuilt bridges over rivers that people were actively trying to kill him for touching. And he couldn't manage a phone call to his own daughter on her birthday. Great. Really great, Mark. He thought about what Sandra would say. She wouldn't yell. That was the thing about her, she never yelled. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's particular brand of silence that said everything yelling could say, but slower and with better aim. She'd look at him over whatever she was reading, and she'd say something like, "It's fine, Dad," and she would mean almost none of it, and they both knew she'd mean almost none of it, and that would be the whole conversation, and he'd carry it for a week. His headlights caught the wet road in yellowed cones. The mountains had disappeared an hour ago. Nothing existed beyond the 50 feet of illuminated asphalt in front of him, and even that was negotiable. He was thinking about the hiked-up cost of lumber. He was thinking about the Delgado Foundation pour. He was thinking about whether the forecast called for this kind of rain, or if Colorado had simply decided to stop warning people before it catastrophized. He was not thinking about a woman in the middle of the road until she was there. Standing, center lane, not moving, not flinching, facing him directly as his headlights hit her like a question she'd been waiting to answer. Mark's foot found the brake before his brain completed the thought. The truck responded eventually, slowly, the way vehicles respond on wet roads when physics has opinions, and the back end skated 2 feet to the right before the tires. Caught and everything stopped. 5 feet, maybe 4. Between the front bumper and her bare feet on the wet asphalt. His hands were still locked on the wheel. She hadn't moved. That was the part that his brain kept trying to process. He'd come at her in 2 tons of metal at 50 miles an hour, and she stood there the way people stand when they're watching something far away. Not at him, not at the headlights, through them, like the truck was a suggestion she was considering declining. Mark sat in the stopped vehicle for 1 full second, 2, long enough to notice his own heartbeat in his throat, the way his hands had gone bloodless, where they gripped the wheel, the way the hazard lights had automatically clicked on, without him touching anything. Then he got out. The rain was a physical thing. It hit him across the shoulders, like a flat hand, soaked through his flannel in the time it took to straighten up. He left the door open, engine running. She was still standing there, 15 feet from his bumper now, from his angle. Taller than she'd looked from behind the windshield. Dark hair completely saturated, plastered against her face, her neck, both shoulders. The dress cream or white, impossible to tell, under this much water clung to her in a way that made her seem exposed, even though she was technically clothed. And her feet, no shoes. Just feet on wet highway in October in Colorado at 9:47 at night. "Hey." He raised his voice over the rain. "Hey, are you?" She turned, not quickly, like she was operating at a different pace than everything around her. Like the storm and the headlights and the truck that had nearly killed her were all moving at one speed, and she was moving at another, slower one, and she was not particularly interested in synchronizing. Her eyes were pale, very pale, blue in the way that certain winter skies are blue, almost colorless. There were no pupils, it seemed, for a half second, and then he blinked and there they were. The eyes themselves held nothing that he recognized. Not fear, not shock, not even relief that she wasn't dead, which, given the last 30 seconds, seemed like the minimum appropriate response. Vacant was too harsh a word. Empty was wrong too. It was more like looking at someone who was trying very hard to locate themselves and hadn't quite managed it yet. "Ma'am." He took 2 careful steps forward, hands slightly raised, the way he'd learned to approach uncertain situations, telegraphing everything, committing to nothing threatening. "Are you hurt? Were you in an accident?" "Nothing. I'm not going to. I'm just trying to figure out if you need." He stopped, tried again. "What's your name?" That one landed differently. He watched her process it, watched something behind her eyes work at the question, the way a person works. At a word in a language they used to speak. Her brow moved. The smallest crease. "Laura." The word came out rough, scraped, like a voice that hadn't been used recently, or hadn't been trusted recently. "I think Laura." She sounded uncertain about her own name. That particular uncertainty, not the hesitation of someone lying, but the hesitation of someone genuinely searching, settled something in his chest that he didn't have a word for. He pulled his jacket off, already soaked through the sleeves, but still warmer than nothing. He held it out toward her, not offering exactly, more presenting, letting her decide what to do with it. She looked at the jacket, looked at him, then reached for it with hands that were so cold. When they briefly touched his knuckles, that he almost pulled back from the shock of it. "Okay," he said. Kept his voice level, the voice he'd used in tighter situations. Not calm, exactly controlled. "Laura, my name is Mark. I'm going to put you in my truck, get you warm. Then we figure out what comes next." She put the jacket on without protest. It hung past her hips. She looked at the truck, the way she'd looked at the highway as a fact, requiring consideration. "Hospital," he tried. Her whole body changed, shoulders up, hands closed. The word hit her like a bad memory. "No, sharp. Not loud but sharp, the way a temperature drop is sharp. Not a hospital, please." The please was what did it. The please was so raw that it bypassed every reasonable internal argument he had. "Building, call 911. Call the county sheriff. Don't put strange women in your truck on a mountain highway in a storm." And landed somewhere. Below his thinking, he'd seen that kind of fear before. Not the fear of something unfamiliar. The fear of something specific, something that had already happened. "Okay," he said. "No hospital." He guided her hand on her elbow, barely touching around to the passenger side. Opened the door. She climbed in with the careful deliberateness of someone reacquainting herself with the mechanics of ordinary movement. He jogged back around in rain that felt colder by the minute, got in, cranked the heat to maximum. The cab filled slowly with warm air. The sound of rain against the roof was immense. Between them, the dashboard glowed orange and green. Mark picked up his phone. Her hand came down on his wrist. Faster than he expected and stronger. She'd seemed boneless out there on the road, insubstantial. Her grip said otherwise. "No hospital." Repeating it, but softer now. Afraid she'd been too sharp. "I wasn't." He set the phone face down on the center console. "I wasn't calling for that. I have a daughter at home. I should tell her I'm." He stopped, recalibrated. "Is there anyone I can call for you? Family? Someone who knows where you were going?" She was looking straight ahead through the rain-blurred windshield. "I don't know," she said, and then, quieter, like telling herself, "I don't know anyone. There's nothing before tonight that I can." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Mark had met people whose memories had been disrupted. Rodriguez in his unit had lost nearly 4 months after a blast outside a fire base in the southwest. Clean gap, before and after, nothing in between. The doctors called it dissociative amnesia. Rodriguez called it a gift. Eventually, because what came back in pieces was bad enough. But this was different from Rodriguez. Rodriguez had known he'd lost something, had been oriented to his present reality, had understood where he was, could tell you that day and his own name and what he'd eaten for breakfast even when he couldn't access the missing months. This woman didn't know if Laura was her real name. Mark looked at her for a long moment. The heat was doing something. Some color was slowly returning to her lips. She was younger than he'd first thought. Late 30s maybe. Not a girl. A woman who'd lived a life before this road, even if she couldn't locate it right now. Under his headlights earlier he'd noticed a scar along the left side of her jaw. Fine, old, faded pale. The kind of scar that had stopped being noticeable to the person who wore it years ago. The kind that meant something had happened once, when she was younger. Her hands, folded now in her lap, long fingers. The way they rested said something had learned something once about where to put themselves. "I have a house in Silver Ridge," Mark said. 10 minutes. There's a spare room. You can stay tonight, get warm, get food. Tomorrow we figure out what to do." He paused. "My daughter's there. She's 18. You're safe." She turned her head and looked at him with those near colorless eyes. Why would you do that? He thought about that question for a beat longer than she probably expected. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because he wanted to give her a real one, rather than the convenient one. "Because right now you need somewhere to be," he said. "And I've got somewhere." That landed somewhere on her face that he couldn't quite read. Not gratitude, not suspicion. Something that looked like the early stages of a decision. She nodded once. He put the truck in drive. They didn't talk for the 10 minutes into Silver Ridge. The radio had been off since he left Denver. He didn't turn it on now. The rain eased slightly as they dropped in elevation off the highway, still heavy but losing its sideways aggression. He could see road again. Real road, both lanes. Silver Ridge after 9 on a Friday in October was not a town so much as a collection of lit windows. The hardware store, the diner that closed at 8, but left its sign on. The bar that would stay open until 1, because this was Colorado, and people had feelings about that. His street Maple, 2 blocks off the main, was quiet. And residential in the way small mountain towns were residential, meaning the houses were close together, because nobody wanted to be too far from a neighbor. When winter came with real intent, Carol Langley's porch light was on. Of course it was. Carol was 72 years old, a retired social worker, who had spent 30 years in Jefferson County, dealing with the full human inventory of crisis, exploitation, and occasional grace. She was his next-door neighbor, surrogate grandmother to Sandra in every way that mattered, and pathologically incapable of going to bed before 11. She sat in her porch chair, under the overhang watching his truck pull in, and he could feel her eyes doing their assessment work before he'd even cut the engine. He got out first, came around to open the passenger door. Laura stepped down carefully, the jacket still enormous around her. The front door opened. Sandra stood in the frame, backlit, one hand on the door and the other holding her phone. She was wearing the old Colorado State hoodie she'd had since junior year, and the expression of someone who has been waiting for a while, but has decided not to lead with that. She looked at her father, then at the woman next to him, then back. Not a word. She stepped aside to make room and disappeared back into the house, and reappeared 12 seconds later with a folded towel. That was Sandra. That had always been Sandra. Action over announcement. Mark made quick introductions. Carol, who had materialized at the edge of her porch at some point in the last minute, received a significant look from Mark, that she answered with a look of her own that said several things, including, but not limited to, "I see this, I have questions, and we will be discussing this in the morning." She retreated. The porch light stayed on. Inside, the house was warm in the way of older houses that had been lived in for years, not just physically warm, but textured with it. the warmth of cooking and arguments, and a particular kind of accumulated daily life. Ella's drawings on the fridge. No, Sandra's drawings, from years ago, a few of which had been there so long they'd become part of the architecture. A basket of unfolded laundry on the couch. A pair of work boots by the door that Mark kept meaning to put away somewhere more organized. Sandra led Laura to the bathroom with the towel and a spare set of clothes from her own room without being asked. Mark heard the shower start, stewed in his kitchen and put the kettle on, because he needed to do something with his hands. He stood there while the water heated and tried to explain his own decision to himself. Failed, mostly. The tactical breakdown was simple enough. Woman in road, near miss, shock or trauma, no apparent place to go. Response, provide shelter, reassess in morning. That was the decision as a procedure. But there was something else underneath the procedure, some recognition he couldn't fully articulate yet. The way she'd said, I think Laura. The way she'd reached for the jacket with those ice-cold hands, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to want warmth. He'd seen that particular combination of qualities before. In people who'd been in situations where their own needs had been systematically treated as irrelevant. People who'd stopped expecting accommodation. The shower ran for a long time. Mark made tea. Sandra came back downstairs, sat at the table with her laptop open and her attention not on it. She's hurt? Sandra asked. Not physically. Not that I can see. But, he turned with 2 mugs. Set one in front of his daughter. She doesn't know where she came from. Couldn't tell me what was before tonight. Sandra processed that the way she processed most things without visible reaction, for a moment, and then with complete precision. You should call someone official. I know. But you're not going to yet. I want to wait until He sat down. She's scared of something specific, Sand. Not general scared. Specific. I want to give her a night before I hand her off to a system she might have reason to be scared of. Sandra looked at him over her mug. That look, the Maria look, the one that said she was deciding whether to push or let it stand. She let it stand. Laura came downstairs 20 minutes later. She'd found one of Sandra's older sweaters, dark blue, oversized, one she'd had since high school, and a pair of jeans that were slightly short on her. Her hair was wrapped in the towel, dark and damp against the white of it. Some color had come into her face from the hot shower. She looked like a person now, still hollowed out somewhere around the eyes, still cautious in every movement, but present in a way she hadn't been on the highway. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the room the way you look at something that might or might not be safe to fully enter. Sandra looked up. Tea's still hot. Laura crossed the room and sat down at the table with the care of someone who'd learned not to assume chairs were permanent. She wrapped both hands around the mug. Sandra slid toward her. Thank you. Low, real, the kind of thank you that costs something. Are you hungry? Mark asked. She thought about it like it was a complicated question. I don't, maybe. Yes. I think yes. He found leftover soup in the refrigerator and heated it without ceremony. Sandra had gone back to her laptop but wasn't reading anything, just creating the appearance of being occupied. Laura watched the kitchen with the focused attention of someone cataloging everything in case they needed to remember it later. When he set the soup down, she stared at it for a second, picked up the spoon, ate slowly. There's a room upstairs, Mark said. Second door, you can sleep there. Lock's broken, but there's a chair for the handle. She nodded, still eating. Do you want us to call anyone tonight? A number, a name, anything? No, not sharp this time. Just honest. There's no one I can't think of anyone. Sandra closed her laptop. How far did you walk tonight? Laura's eyes moved to her. I don't know exactly. Got in a ride partway. Got out. Kept going. In that dress. No shoes. I left in a hurry. Sandra absorbed that. Let the space sit. Then you can have the room as long as you need it. Mark looked at his daughter. Sandra met his gaze. She clearly needs it. Laura looked at Sandra for a long moment, some calculation going on. You're not worried, Laura said. Half question. I'm 18. I grew up with a combat engineer for a dad. I've had the read the situation, not the assumption talk, like 40 times. Sandra picked up her laptop. Also, you're eating soup with both elbows on the table, and you look exhausted. Not exactly a threat profile. Something moved across Laura's face, the shortest possible version of a smile. When she finished the soup, she stood and washed the bowl in the sink, which Mark had not asked her to do, and Sandra clocked with a barely perceptible lift of her eyebrow. Laura looked at the family photos on the refrigerator. For a moment, one in particular, Sandra at maybe 12, gap-toothed, holding up a fish with both hands, Mark behind her with an expression of helpless parental pride. A woman beside them, brown eyes. The same smile that was now sitting across the table from Mark in its 18-year-old iteration. Your wife asked? Maria. She passed 3 years ago. Laura was quiet for a second. She looks like someone who laughed a lot. He hadn't heard it put quite that way before. Yeah, he said. She did. Laura went upstairs. He heard the door close. He heard the chair, the old Windsor chair that had been in that room since Maria, her reading spot, being moved into position under the handle. Sandra stood, gathered her laptop, reached past him to rinse her mug. She's in trouble, Sandra said. Yeah, the specific kind, not the general kind. Yeah. Sandra looked at him with Maria's eyes. Then we figure it out. She went upstairs. Mark sat alone in the kitchen, with the rain still going outside, quieter now, and the tick of the wall clock and the distant sound of someone who'd been running for a long time finally stopped and breathing. He should sleep. He didn't sleep. He sat in the recliner and thought about the scar on her jaw and the way she'd looked through his headlights rather than at them, and eventually he must have crossed some threshold, because the next thing he was aware of was different. Different light. Not rain. Silence. 6:23 in the morning. The rain had ended sometime in the night, and from upstairs barely audible the sound of movement. Footsteps on old hardwood, the kitchen stairs. He kept still. The refrigerator opened, the cabinet. Small sounds. Specific sounds. He knew every sound this kitchen made, and he catalogued them as they happened. The burner on the stove, the medium one that heated faster than you expected. The pantry door, the particular sound of the wooden block, where they kept their chocolate, because Sandra insisted on keeping actual chocolate in the house rather than the powder, and Mark had stopped fighting that particular battle around the same time Sandra turned 16. He got up. She was standing at the stove with her back to him, doing 3 things at once in the small, efficient way of someone working in a kitchen they knew. Except this wasn't a kitchen she knew. That was the part that made him stop in the doorway and just watch for a moment. Her hands knew what they were doing. Her mind was somewhere else, he could tell by the quality of her stillness. But her hands broke the chocolate by feel, added it to the saucepan at the right moment, stirred without looking. He'd seen this before, once. Rodriguez again. 3 months gone from his memory, and he could still strip and reassemble his service rifle in the dark, under 2 minutes every time. The body keeps its own records. Couldn't sleep, Laura said, without turning around. Not great, no. She stepped to the left, a subtle movement, creating space at the stove, and reached for a second mug. He came around the counter and leaned against the opposite side, watching. She added milk, adjusted the heat, found the cinnamon in the spice rack on the first try. How did you know where that was? He asked. She looked at the cinnamon, then at the spice rack, frowned. I don't know. I just knew it would be there. My wife kept it in the same spot. She handed him the mug and turned back to the stove for the other one. He wrapped his hands around it. Hot, real chocolate. Nothing like the mix Sandra claimed to despise. Bitter and warm, and something else that didn't have a name exactly. He watched her carry her mug to the table and sit down. She was starting to occupy space differently than she had last night. Still careful, still that wariness underneath everything. But there was something more anchored about the way she moved this morning, like a few hours in one place had let her recalibrate some internal measurement. I dreamed in pieces, she said. Not looking at him, looking at the mug. Not connected, a room, the color white, someone saying my name but not Laura, a different name, and a woman, older, gray hair. She smelled like expensive perfume and something underneath it that I don't have a word for. Can you describe the room? White walls, white curtains, bed with rails. The kind of rails you have in, she stopped, a medical room, but not a regular hospital, something quieter. The sounds were different, the air recycled differently. Mark kept his face even. You were a patient somewhere, or they wanted me to think of it that way. That sentence sat there between them for a moment. There's something else, she said. When I try to find the name that wasn't Laura, I can almost catch it. But when I reach for it, it becomes the white room instead. Like something built over it. Sandra appeared on the stairs at 6:47 because Sandra had the internal clock of someone who needed neither alarm nor sunlight, had possessed it since the age of 8, and it was one of the 17 ways she was completely unlike her father. She stopped on the bottom step, looked at the two of them at the kitchen table in the early light with their mugs. She said nothing, came down, poured herself coffee. Did either of you sleep? She asked. Some, Mark said. No, Laura said. Cool. So we're all running on empty. Great start. Sandra sat down with her coffee and her laptop. I was thinking, a knock at the door. Not a morning knock. Not a neighbor with coffee knock. 3 solid impacts, evenly spaced, the knock of someone who does this professionally. Mark was standing before he knew he'd decided to stand. Carol Langley, in her housecoat and absolutely no apology for it, stood on the porch with a phone in her hand, and an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. In 30 years of professional social work and 20 more years of retirement, Carol Langley had developed an extremely precise emotional vocabulary. He could read her the way you learned to read certain maps, and what her face was doing right now was not something he'd seen from her in 3 years of being her neighbor. Come in, he stepped back. She came directly to the kitchen table, sat down across from Laura, looked at her the way she'd looked at 100 people, in 100 impossible situations, not with pity, not with judgment, but with the particular attention of someone whose job it was to actually see people rather than their circumstances. Then she looked at the scar on Laura's jaw. Carol had her phone out. She was navigating with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going. She placed the phone screen up on the table and slid it across to Laura. An article, small thumbnail photograph, old newsprint scanned to digital, a girl 19 in the photo, standing in front of iron gates and a fountain, pale eyes, defined jaw, and along the left side of that jaw, barely visible even in the photo, a faint line, Vivian Harlow, daughter of Ronald Harlow, founder and CEO of Harlow Industries, Aspen, Colorado, disappeared October 2004. No confirmed cause, no body recovered. Investigated as possible runaway, possible abduction. Case technically still open. 20 years. Laura picked up the phone with both hands. She held it at an angle, studying the photograph. Her breathing changed not dramatically, but he noticed the way he noticed everything about her now. A slight shallowing. The chest rising faster. The gates, she said. Her voice was different. Tighter, somewhere between recognition and terror of being wrong about it. I know those gates. The iron, there's a detail at the top, 2 scrolls that face each other. Not symmetrical. The left one is slightly higher. She set the phone down, pressed both palms flat on the table, and the fountain. Lily pads on a granite basin. They had to replant them every 2 years because of the altitude. And she stopped. Someone was annoyed about the expense. I remember the argument. Except I don't remember who. I can't see the face, your father, Carol said. Gentle, but direct. The voice of someone who had learned that gentleness that delays necessary information is its own kind of cruelty. Ronald Harlow. He died 5 years ago, heart attack. But he never stopped looking for his daughter. He spent, the articles say, tens of millions on investigators alone. Laura's eyes came up. He's gone, yes. But the company is still there, still in trust according to Colorado estate law. Waiting on the outcome of the air search, Carol retrieved her phone. There's a 25-year window on the legal declaration of death. She looked at the date, less than a week. Sandra had her laptop open, both hands on the keys. She wasn't pretending to be occupied now. Mark sat down. If this is real, Laura said slowly. She didn't say the name. Then where have I been? 20 years is. She touched her jaw. Found the scar with 2 fingertips the way she probably had done 1,000 times without thinking about it. I didn't do this to myself. No, Carol said. You didn't. A silence that had weight to it. Outside, a bird was doing something optimistic in the oak tree that had no business being that cheerful given the quantity of water on every surface. Then Sandra looked up from her laptop. Her face had an expression Mark recognized. The look she got when she'd found the thing nobody else had looked for yet. "Brian Thompson," she said. "He's Carol's nephew. He does corporate fraud cases in Denver. He worked with a woman named Stephanie Harris, former FBI, Financial Crimes Division." She looked at Carol. "You gave me his number 2 years ago when I was doing that mock trial research project, I remember. We need him here, today." Not in his office. "Here." Sandra looked at her father. "And Dad, before we call him?" "There's a car at the end of the street." He went to the front window, stood to the side, not directly in the frame. Maple Street at 7 in the morning was quiet, the way small-town streets were quiet, and the dark gray sedan, parked at the far end, with its engine running and its windows too dark for the ordinary context of a residential street, was not part of this neighborhood's ordinary texture. He'd learned what surveillance looked like, not because the army had taught him specifically more. Because you absorbed certain things when your job involved assessing terrain for threats. When you spent enough time in places where what looked harmless was frequently not harmless, where a parked vehicle at an unusual angle was worth noting. This was worth noting. He came back to the kitchen, kept his voice even. "Sandra, call Brian Thompson now. Tell him Carol's neighbor found something significant and it needs a lawyer's eyes before anyone else's." He looked at Carol. "Is there anyone else who knows she's here?" "No." "Let's keep it that way." He sat across from Laura. She was watching him with those pale eyes that were already less empty than they'd been on the highway, that were filling up with something that looked more like calculation than fear now, something coming awake behind them. "Someone already knows you're in Silver Ridge," he said. "I want you to understand that before we go any further, whoever held you, they're looking." Laura breathed in, out, long and slow. "Then we need to move faster than they are," she said, no panic in her voice. Something else. Something harder underneath the exhaustion and the fractured memory and the bare feet on wet highway. Something that had been waiting, under the surface of 20 years, for a reason to come forward. It sounded, Mark thought, like the beginning of a decision. Outside, the gray sedan hadn't moved. The morning was getting lighter by the minute, the October sun beginning its slow argument with the leftover clouds, and inside the small house, at the end of Maple Street, 4 people sat around a kitchen table with a 20-year-old with a 20-year-old mystery between them and a sedan full of someone else's intentions at the end of their street, and everything was about to change in ways none of them could fully see yet. But the chocolate was still warm, and Laura was still here, and sometimes, Mark thought, those 2 facts are enough to start with. Brian Thompson arrived at 2 in the afternoon with a carry-on bag and the particular energy of someone who'd cancelled 3 things to get there and didn't regret any of them. He was 40, broad through the shoulders, wearing a suit jacket over a flannel shirt in the way of a man who'd started the day formal and then been honest about his actual personality. Carol let him in. He stopped in the hallway and looked at the assembled group, Mark at the counter, Sandra at the table with her second coffee, Laura sitting with her hands folded and her eyes reading him before he'd said his name. "Stephanie Harris is 20 minutes behind me," he said. "She's been looking into the Harlow Industries ownership structure since Carol called this morning. I'm going to need someone to tell me exactly what happened, starting from when you pulled off the highway." He looked at Mark. "And then she's going to need to tell me the rest." He looked at Laura. His voice was direct but not unkind. "I've seen a lot of corporate fraud cases. What I'm hearing from my aunt sounds like something worse. So I need you to know that what you say in this room is covered by privilege. I'm representing both of you as of right now, and nothing leaves this house without your agreement." Laura studied him for a long moment, processing. "There was a woman," she said finally. Her voice had been getting steadier all day, like a signal that was finding its frequency. Gray hair, silver, really, expensive clothes. She ran meetings like she was the only person in the room worth listening to. She was at every important event in my father's life for years before I. She paused. "She put something in my tea." Brian set his bag down on the table, opened it, pulled out a legal pad. "Tell me everything you remember," he said. "In any order, we'll sort it afterward." Outside, the gray sedan was still there. Mark stood at the kitchen window with his cold coffee and watched it idle at the end of Maple Street, and thought about what Laura had said in the dark this morning. The white room, the recycled air, 20 years in a place that wanted her to believe she was no one, and the way she'd looked at that photograph of the iron gates. Not like someone confronted with a possibility, like someone who'd found the door they'd forgotten existed. That sedan at the end of the street meant they were out of time for careful. But Laura was sitting at his kitchen table with a legal pad and a lawyer and a retired social worker and a daughter who'd cancelled her own plans without being asked, and whatever was coming next was going to have to come through all of that first. Not his department, maybe. Not a problem that a structural engineer and a father and an accidental good Samaritan could solve. But he'd gotten this far on instinct, and his instinct, which had not significantly failed him in 37 years of hard use, said, "Don't let go." Stephanie Harris arrived at 2:20 with a laptop bag, a box of files, and the kind of focused energy that made every room feel slightly smaller than it had been before she walked in. 44 years old. Brown hair pulled back without ceremony. The way she moved said she'd spent years in rooms where moving efficiently mattered, and retirement from the bureau hadn't convinced her body to slow down. She set the files on the table without preamble, looked at Laura. Looked long enough that anyone else might have found it uncomfortable. Laura looked back. Didn't blink first. "Former FBI," Stephanie said. "Financial crimes, 12 years. I left to do this because the bureau moves like a glacier and I don't have the patience." She opened the laptop. "I've been looking at Harlow Industries' ownership structure since 7 this morning. What I found before I got in the car is enough to make me drive 4 hours on short notice. So let's talk." Brian had his legal pad. Sandra had moved her laptop to the counter to make room, and was now doing something that she described as research, and that Mark suspected involved considerably more than that. Carol sat at the end of the table with coffee, and the expression of a woman who has seen enough human catastrophe to remain calm, but not enough to pretend it didn't matter. Stephanie laid photographs across the table in a specific order. Not random. Deliberate. The order told a story before anyone said a word. Ronald Harlow installed security cameras throughout the Aspen estate and his primary office building in 2001, Stephanie said. He was meticulous about it. State-of-the-art for the time. But he didn't trust networked storage. Everything recorded to a local server. Offline. No cloud. No external connections. She tapped a photograph, an aerial image of a property, a secondary building barely visible at the tree line. That server is in a climate-controlled storage room in a secondary structure on the property. Running on solar backup, has been running continuously for 23 years. The table was quiet. He didn't know it survived, Laura said. Not a question. Margaret Wilson took possession of all documented Harlow assets after Ronald's death in 2019. But this server wasn't documented. It wasn't in any inventory because Ronald didn't want it in any inventory. I found it through an IP address that appeared in biennially filed property tax maintenance records for a Harlow LLC one-line item, labeled mechanical equipment, electricity drawer consistent with a server rack. Stephanie looked at her with the direct gaze of someone who had learned to deliver difficult information cleanly. I accessed it remotely through the LLC records this morning. The footage exists. I haven't had time to go through all of it yet, but it exists. Laura put both hands flat on the table. Breathed. 20 years of footage, Brian said. The night of the disappearance. Everything before it. Everything after, until the estate was locked down in 2019. Stephanie closed the photograph folder. We're going to need a court order to formally retrieve it, but the preview I accessed this morning. She stopped, chose her words carefully. It contradicts every official account of what happened on October 14, 2004. Outside, the gray sedan had moved. Mark had been checking the window every 20 minutes, and sometime between 1:45 and 2:15, It had repositioned further down the block now, angled differently, which meant whoever was inside had decided proximity was less important than sight lines, which meant they were adjusting, which meant they were patient. Patient was worse than aggressive. Aggressive made mistakes fast. Patient made them slowly, carefully, in ways that were harder to catch. He said nothing about this yet. Let the room stay on the footage. What did you see? Laura asked. Stephanie looked at her for a moment, the kind of look that says, I'm going to tell you the truth, because you deserve it, and also because I think you can hold it. You weren't out of control, Stephanie said. You weren't the one who was dangerous that night. Something moved across Laura's face that was not quite relief and not quite grief, and might have been the particular anguish of having suspected a truth for a very long time and then being confirmed in it. 20 years of being told the opposite of what your own memory, however damaged, however buried, kept trying to surface. She pressed her lips together, nodded once. Brian wrote something on his legal pad. We need that footage formally secured before Wilson's lawyers can make a move. I can have an emergency motion filed in Pitkin County by 5 o'clock today. Do it, Laura said. First time she'd spoken with that kind of clean of authority. No hesitation, no qualifier. Just do it. Like someone who'd forgotten they were allowed to make decisions and was in the process of remembering. Mark's phone rang. Unknown number. He showed the screen to Stephanie, who gave him a quick nod that meant answer it. We want to know what this is. He picked up. The voice was female. Measured. The particular brand of composed that required active maintenance. The composure of someone who was genuinely concerned about what happened if they lost it. Not the calm of peace. The calm of control, Mr. Anderson. Warm on the surface. The warmth of something that had practiced. My name is Margaret Wilson. I'm the CEO of Harlow Industries. And I believe we have a situation that would benefit from an adult conversation before it becomes unnecessarily complicated. Mark said nothing. Let her continue. Let her think he was considering. She told him that Laura was confused. She told him that Laura had a long documented history of dissociative episodes, that she'd been receiving specialized care for years, that her disappearance from a care facility 6 days ago was a medical emergency and not the sinister event that certain people might want to construct it as. She told him she understood how Laura's version of events sounded compelling, even. Trauma narratives were like that. The mind built stories to protect itself. She told him that she could make things very comfortable for a single father with a daughter in college and a mortgage and a construction business operating on margins. The last part was where the warmth finally showed its actual temperature. Mark looked at the window, at the sedan, at Laura across the table watching his face, while the voice she clearly recognized came through the phone speaker. He'd put it on speaker silently 2 sentences in, and the color had drained from Laura's face. The way color drains from something that has been cut off from its source. I'll need to think about that, Mark said. A pause from Wilson, recalibrating. She hadn't expected engagement, she'd expected capitulation or refusal. Engagement kept options open. She liked options. Of course, she said warmly again. Take the time you need. But do keep in mind the situation becomes more complicated the longer it remains unresolved. For everyone. Another pause. The kind that had weight in it. Sandra is at University of Denver, isn't she? First year. That's such an important year. So much pressure. The line went dead. Mark set the phone down on the table. Sandra at the counter had gone very still. She had heard her own name come out of the speaker. Her expression was not fear. Sandra didn't do fear on the surface, but something adjacent to it. The expression of someone who has just been reminded that they exist in someone else's calculation. She knows everything, Sandra said. Steady voice. Careful voice. She's had someone on this house since before we called Brian, which means she had someone watching the highway. Stephanie said, which means she had someone watching the facility in Wyoming, which means she knew Laura left almost immediately. Brian was already on his phone, stepping away from the table. Emergency motion. Pitkin County. He was talking to someone, precise and fast. And Mark had the thought that Carol had raised a person who knew how to move when movement was required. Laura stood up, walked to the kitchen window, stood to the side of it the way Mark had shown her without showing her, the instinctive positioning of someone who'd been briefly told that the window wasn't a safe place to stand and had filed that information away permanently. She called me confused, Laura said, quietly, to the window. That's been her word for 20 years. Not sick, not unstable. Confused. Because confused sounds like something that happens to people who can't be trusted to know what they saw. She's been building that narrative a long time, Stephanie said. I know she has. Laura turned from the window, and there it was again. That quality that had surfaced briefly when she said, do it. Something that lived underneath the fractured memory and the bare feet on the wet highway. Something that had refused to die despite 20 years of very deliberate effort to kill it. Which means we have to move before she finishes building the counter-narrative to this. Once she controls the story publicly, the footage and the paperwork become a war of interpretations, and she has 20 years of infrastructure, and I have. She gestured at the table, the small house, the 4 people around her. This is more than she's counting on, Mark said. Laura looked at him. A long look. I know, she said. That's the only thing I'm counting on. The knock came at 4:15 the next morning. Not aggressive, 3 knocks spaced evenly. Professional. The knock of someone who'd decided that showing up before sunrise was a reasonable choice and had made peace with that decision. Mark was already awake. He'd been awake since 3, sitting in the kitchen with the lights low, reviewing the financial documents Stephanie had printed before she left to make calls from Carol's, keeping the location of the documents distributed, she'd said, in case someone made a move on the house. Sandra was asleep upstairs. Laura was in the spare room. Whether she was sleeping was a question he couldn't answer. He went to the door without turning on the porch light, looked through the side window first. Dr. Donna Webb. He knew the name because Stephanie had said it 2 hours earlier during a phone briefing. 62 years old. Psychiatric credentials from a respectable institution, now somewhat difficult to verify in their specifics, had operated a private outpatient practice in Denver for 15 years, before becoming attached to a series of private residential care facilities. The last of those facilities was operated under the name George Nash Behavioral Health, located outside Casper, Wyoming. She'd been on staff there for 11 years. She was wearing a dark blazer, and the particular expression of someone who had rehearsed this interaction and was confident in the rehearsal. He opened the door. Stephanie was already in the hallway behind him. She'd come back through Carol's connecting gate. At 2 in the morning. Something they'd arranged quiet before she left, because Stephanie Harris had spent 12 years in financial crimes and she knew that the interesting moves almost always happened before dawn. Brian was on the phone in the dining room, voice low. The recording device on the hallway table had been running since 4. Mr. Anderson Webb's voice was professionally modulated, concerned. The concern of someone performing concern rather than experiencing it. I apologize for the hour. I'm Dr. Donna Webb. I'm a psychiatric physician and I'm here regarding a patient who left my care facility last week without authorization. I have reason to believe she may be in your home. You have reason to believe that because someone has been watching this house since yesterday morning, Mark said. Conversational. Not accusatory. Just naming a fact. A small pause. Recalibration. I'm here as a medical professional, Mr. Anderson. My only concern is, do you have a court order? Stephanie stepped into the doorway beside Mark, showed nothing on her face. Anything that legally requires this household to cooperate with you before 7 in the morning. Webb looked at Stephanie. Something shifted in her assessment of the situation. She'd prepared for a construction worker. She hadn't prepared for someone who looked back at her like that. My patient has a documented history of. The documentation was created by you, Stephanie said, or by people operating under your supervision. We know that. So does Brian Thompson, who is currently on the phone with the U.S. Attorney's Office. A beat. I'm going to need you to confirm your name for the recording. Silence. Real silence. Not the pause of someone thinking, the silence of someone who has just realized the room they walked into is not the room they thought it was. Laura appeared at the top of the stairs. She'd heard. She stood at the top with one hand on the railing, and she looked down at the woman in the doorway with an expression that was complicated and specific and not what anyone who'd spent 20 years drugging her into compliance would have expected. Not terror. Something colder. The cold of someone who has had a long time to think about what they would say. She came down the stairs. Webb opened her mouth. "Vivienne, you need..." "Donna." Laura stopped 3 steps from the bottom, eye level with the woman in the doorway. "You told me my father didn't want to see me. You told me he'd given up. You told me that every time I asked." She held the gaze, didn't raise her voice. "He spent 15 years looking. You knew that. You read the reports. You kept them from me." Something happened to Webb's face. The professional composure didn't break exactly, it eroded, piece by piece, from the edges. "I was following protocols that were established by whom?" Brian appeared in the hall behind Mark, phone still in hand. "By Margaret Wilson. By the medical power of attorney that expired when Ronald Harlow died in 2019. Which one of those protocols covers 11 years of continued involuntary treatment after the legal authority for it ceased to exist?" Webb's eyes moved between them, counting. She'd come expecting one man and a confused woman. She'd found a lawyer, a former FBI agent, a man who didn't visibly rattle, and the confused woman standing on the stairs, looking at her like she'd had 20 years to prepare exactly this conversation. "There's a fire at the facility," Stephanie said, quietly, watching Webb's face. "The record storage. Started about 2 hours ago." Webb went still. Not surprised still. The particular stillness of someone receiving information they had already incorporated into a plan. Stephanie saw it. Mark saw it. Remote authorization. Stephanie said, still quiet, still watching. She got a call and authorized the burn. Just in case. In case this went wrong. She looked at Webb directly, except the call was logged, and there's a safe in the facility manager's office. A personal one that doesn't belong to the facility. Somebody put it there 6 years ago, without disclosing it to Nash. The fire crews found it intact. It's been transferred to FBI custody. She held the gaze. "Whatever's in it, Donna, that's not going away." The erosion on Webb's face completed. She looked suddenly older than 62. She looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and had just been informed that carrying it had been pointless. "You don't understand what she's capable of," Webb said, smaller voice now. Under the professionalism, something that sounded like genuine fear. "If this goes wrong, if I cooperate and it doesn't, she has reach." Everywhere. She had reach, Laura said from the stairs. Past tense, she came down the last 3 steps, stood in the hallway. "I have the server footage, Donna. I have the financial records from my mother's deposit box. I have a lawyer and a former federal agent, and about 48 hours before this becomes national news." She paused. One breath. "Help us, and we make sure she never gets near you again. Don't help us, and you take the weight for the parts you can be directly charged with, while she walks." Another pause, shorter. "You've known for a long time that this wasn't going to end well. You're just deciding which way it ends." Silence on the porch. The October dark. A dog somewhere 2 streets over. Webb looked at the ground, looked at Laura, looked at something neither of them could see. "There's a safety deposit box," Webb said. Her voice had lost its shape. "First National Bank in Denver. Box 472. Jennifer Harlow rented it in 2003. Margaret Wilson didn't know about it because Jennifer opened it in her maiden name." She stopped. "I've known about it for years. I never told Margaret, because it was the only piece of insurance I had." Laura looked at Stephanie. Stephanie was already writing. "Get inside," Brian said. "Not unkindly. We need you to say all of that again, with the recording running properly. And then we're going to call someone from the U.S. Attorney's Office who is going to want to hear it directly." Webb came inside, sat at the kitchen table that had started this whole thing 24 hours ago. Looked at her own hands. Stephanie's phone rang. She stepped away to answer. Came back 30 seconds later with an expression Mark hadn't seen from her yet. Controlled urgency. Something big. Wyoming, she said. FBI retrieved the external drive from Nash's safe. They're sending us a preview of the contents. She looked at Laura. And there's something else. When they cleared the facility, the wing that wasn't burning, they found 3 other long-term patients. All involuntary commitments. All documented under medical authority that terminated years ago. She paused. One of them has been there for 8 years. His name is Stephen Morrow. His family filed a missing person report in 2016. The table went quiet. Sandra, who had come silently downstairs at some point in the last 10 minutes and was standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, and her face doing the Maria calculation, said, "She's been doing this to multiple people." Not a question. Multiple situations where someone inconvenient needed to disappear from a legal or financial context, Stephanie said, and Nash's facility was the solution. She looked at the table. At all of them. This isn't one case anymore, this is a pattern. Laura sat down. The kind of sitting down that happens when your legs make the decision for you. She pressed both hands over her mouth for a moment, thinking. Or stopping herself from saying what she was thinking. Or both. Because 20 years of believing she was alone in this. 20 years of being told she was singular in her damage, particular in her dysfunction, uniquely and specifically broken in ways that required permanent management. And it was never about her specifically. She had simply been first. "We go public," Laura said from behind her hands. Then she lowered them. "Tomorrow, before Wilson controls the narrative. We go to the press conference, Denver, Capitol Steps, morning news cycle. We present everything we have, and we name the others." She looked at Stephanie. "Can we reach Stephen Morrow's family by morning?" "I can reach them tonight." "Do it." Brian was already on his phone again. Sandra had her laptop open. Carol, who had appeared from somewhere, was putting on a fresh pot of coffee because this was going to be a long night and she'd spent 30 years knowing that long nights required fuel. Mark stood at the window. The sedan was gone, which could mean one of 2 things. Either Wilson had recalled her people because the situation was escalating beyond surveillance management, or she'd moved them to better positions. He didn't know which one yet. He wouldn't know until something moved. He thought about the phone call. Sandra's name in Wilson's mouth. The calm, specific, practiced way she'd said it. The implication underneath, "I know where to reach you through the things you love." He'd been in situations before where the threat was real and specific and pointed directly at something he cared about. The instinct in those situations was always to fortify, pull in, reduce exposure, make the defended perimeter smaller and stronger. But Laura was right about the press conference. The fortified perimeter was exactly what Wilson expected. She'd spent 20 years keeping people contained, keeping situations private, winning in rooms where there were no witnesses. The one thing her entire architecture of control could not survive was light. Which was exactly why she had a PR team and a narrative and a counterstory already building somewhere, and they had roughly 12 hours to make sure theirs landed first. By 2 in the afternoon they were in Denver. Brian had made calls. Stephanie had made different calls. By the time their small convoy, 2 cars, Brian and Stephanie in the lead, Mark and Laura and Sandra following, arrived at the steps of the state capitol building, there were 17 media organizations represented and a crowd that was still growing. Laura had been quiet for most of the drive. Not the vacant quiet of the woman on the highway. Occupied quiet. The quiet of someone running calculations, organizing information, preparing. Sandra had been revising the prepared statement in the passenger seat, making changes in pencil on the printed draft with a precision that made Mark think she had a future in this, if she wanted it. The 3rd paragraph. Sandra said somewhere outside Colorado Springs, without looking up. The line about wrongful confinement, it needs to come before the financial fraud allegations. Sequence matters. You want them emotionally committed to the injustice before you introduce the money. Otherwise, it looks like it's about the money. Laura turned from the window, looked at Sandra. "You're right." "How do you know that?" "I read," Sandra said. Also, Dad makes me watch the news with him every Sunday and analyzes why people win and lose public arguments. It's very nerdy and also apparently useful. Laura looked at Mark. He kept his eyes on the road. The Capitol steps were louder than he expected. More cameras, more voices. The particular compressed electricity of a large crowd that knew it was about to hear something significant and was trying to keep itself from spilling over before it arrived. Laura got out of the car and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Just stood there, letting the scale of it land. Then she straightened. Something in her spine. Something that had maybe always been there. That had been pressed down, always been there. That had been pressed down for 20 years. And was now reasserting itself with the patience of things that have been waiting long enough. She walked up the steps. Mark stayed one pace behind and to the left. Not as an escort, not as management, as a person who was there. She spoke for 22 minutes, without notes after the first page, without hesitation after the first 30 seconds. She told the story, the way it had happened, not the story she'd been given, not the story that had been constructed over her and around her, and instead of her for 2 decades, but the actual sequence of events, as she now understood them and could document them. She named the facility. She named Webb, who was currently in a federal building 8 blocks away. She named the other patients by their first names only, at Stephanie's legal instruction, Stephen. Patricia, James, real people who had real families and had been missing for years. She named Margaret Wilson last, clearly, with the full title and the full name and the specific allegations attached to each. And then Wilson walked up the steps. Of course she did, because Wilson had calculated that showing up was better than not showing up. That absence looked like guilt and presence, looked like confidence. And she had spent decades being the person in every room who looked most like they belonged there. She was flanked by lawyers. She had a tablet. She had a counter-narrative fully prepared, and she deployed it with the precision of someone who had been doing this her entire career. The screen she'd brought showed footage, or something presented as footage of a young woman in what appeared to be Ronald Harlow's office, out of control, damaged, not to be trusted. The image quality was degraded in specific ways, the kind of degradation that could happen naturally, or could be applied. The crowd shifted. Mark felt it shift. The particular uncertainty of people who have just been shown 2 conflicting things and don't know which one to believe. Laura stood at the microphone and looked at the footage on Wilson's screen, and for one visible, terrible moment, the doubt showed on her face. Because that was the thing about 20 years of being told you were wrong about your own experience. It didn't disappear because you'd found the truth. It sat underneath and waited for moments exactly like this one. Mark moved without thinking, walked forward, stood next to her at the microphone, didn't say anything. Just stood there, shoulder almost touching hers. Sandra appeared from the other side. She'd had the laptop open in the car, and she walked up those steps with it, under her arm like she'd been planning this exact moment because she had. Because Sandra planned things. Because she was her mother's daughter in the ways that mattered most. She took the secondary microphone that Brian had arranged. My name is Sandra Anderson. I'm a first-year pre-law student at the University of Denver. Her voice was level, clear, no performance in it, just information being delivered. This week I accessed the public probate records for Ronald Harlow's estate, on file at the Pitkin County Courthouse. I found 3 amended versions of his will, each one progressively more favorable to Margaret Wilson. The final amendment, dated September 2017, assigns primary beneficiary status to her directly. She looked at Wilson, not with hostility, with the clear-eyed directness of someone presenting facts. Ronald Harlow suffered a stroke in March of 2016. His medical records, which became partially public during a 2017 insurance dispute, document reduced fine motor control in his right hand. The signature on the September 2017 amendment is steady and precise. It is inconsistent with his documented post-stroke signature from every other legal document filed that year. She closed the laptop. I have copies for every media organization represented here, And I've submitted the full comparison to the Colorado State Bar. The crowd had stopped shifting. It had stopped being uncertain. That particular energy had changed into something different, something that built from the edges inward. Stephanie, from somewhere in the second row, connected her laptop to the main screen. The footage that appeared was not degraded. It was clear and properly time-stamped, carrying the metadata of a system that had been running continuously for 23 years. It showed the interior of Ronald Harlow's office on the night of October 14, 2004. It showed a young woman backing toward the far wall, with her hands raised. It showed Margaret Wilson moving toward her, with deliberate, unhurried calm. It showed what happened next in enough detail that there was nothing left to interpret. Wilson stood perfectly still for 3 seconds after the footage ran. 3 seconds is a long time to stand still when every camera on the steps is pointed at you. Then the composure went, not dramatically, not in the way of movie villains. More like a structure when the load-bearing element finally fails, everything holding its position for a moment, after the thing that was holding it up is gone, and then settling, and then the shape of the whole thing changing. Federal agents had been present for the last 6 minutes, at the request of the U.S. Attorney's Office. Wilson looked at Laura as the agents moved, one last look, calculating to the end, trying to find the angle, the exit, the way this could still be managed, and finding nothing. Because the footage was already on every screen. Because Sandra's document comparison was already in 14 media inboxes. Because Donna Webb was 8 blocks away giving a formal statement, and Stephanie Harris had copies of everything, in 3 separate secure locations. Laura looked back at her. She didn't feel the satisfaction she'd expected to feel. She'd spent years, or the years she could access, imagining what this moment would look like. The account balanced, the truth out loud, the person responsible for what had been done to her standing in front of consequences. What she actually felt was something simpler and stranger, the feeling of a door opening onto a room she'd forgotten existed. 20 years of being held in place, and now the place was gone, and she was standing in open air, and it turned out that open air was just ordinary air, neither better nor worse than expected, just present, available. Hers. On the drive back, Sandra fell asleep in the passenger seat within 15 minutes, head against the window. Out completely, the way young people could collapse into sleep after adrenaline the way older people couldn't quite manage anymore. Laura sat in the back, quiet again. Different quiet than any of the previous ones. She named herself first, Mark said, just to the windshield, not requiring an answer. She's going to be good at this, Laura said. Her mother would have been insufferable about it. A pause. What was she like? Laura asked. Mark thought about how to answer that. He had 100 answers. He'd been answering that question for 3 years in various forms, and he still hadn't found one that felt complete. Because the complete answer was too large for any sentence to hold. She kept a list, he said. Running list, on a notepad in the kitchen, of things she wanted to do. Not bucket list things, ordinary things. Try that new soup place on Colfax. Reorganize the hall closet. Teach Sandra to make her grandmother's pie crust. He paused. When she got sick, she started doing them faster. Not crossing them off, she'd do one and add 3 more. Like the list was the thing that kept her going. Not the completion of it. Silence from the back seat. She sounds like someone who understood something important, Laura said. Yeah. She did. He watched the highway. I keep adding to the list. Started doing it about a year after. Didn't realize I was doing it until I looked at the notepad one morning, and the handwriting had changed. When they got back to Silver Ridge, Stephanie was waiting with news from Wyoming. The contents of Nash's safe had been documented. George Nash had agreed to full cooperation in exchange for a negotiated charge reduction. Stephen Morrow had been contacted by his family and was currently at a hospital in Denver, confused and disoriented and fundamentally intact in ways that the doctors said were frankly remarkable, given 8 years of pharmaceutical management. There were 2 others. One was in contact with family, one was not yet speaking. Laura read the summary twice, folded it, set it on the kitchen table. We need a place, she said. Not the estate, not a facility, something in between. Somewhere people like Stephen can go when they don't know how to go home yet. She looked at the table, at the window, at the mountains visible in the October light, burnt orange and amber, and the deep green of evergreen that didn't change with the season. I know where to build it. I know how to fund it. She looked at Mark. I don't know how to run it. You find people who do, he said. That's how your father built the company. He knew what he wanted and he found people who knew how to build it. She looked at him. I didn't know him, she said. Not sad, just the fact of it, clean and without decoration. He died looking for me, and I never got to know him. You know what he built. You know what he refused to sell even when it would have been easier. You know the fountain with the lily pads that he kept replanting every 2 years because someone he loved wanted them there. He paused. That's not nothing. Laura looked at the window. The gray sedan wasn't there anymore. It wouldn't come back. And somewhere in a federal building downtown, Margaret Wilson was in a room without exits. And the story she'd spent 20 years constructing was in the process of becoming evidence. Sandra woke up at the kitchen table at 7, disoriented for approximately 4 seconds, and then fully operational, which was exactly her ratio. She looked at the files spread across the surface. Looked at Stephanie, looked at Laura. What did I miss? Everything, Laura said. And for the first time since a highway in the rain, something that was unambiguously a smile crossed her face. Full. Real. The kind that had been waiting under everything else. For longer than anyone knew. Typical, Sandra said, and reached for the nearest file. 6 months passed the way difficult months pass. Not slowly, not quickly. In pieces, some of which you kept and some of which you lost before you could decide whether they mattered. The Harlow estate in Aspen had been legally returned to Laura in November. The transfer handled by Brian, with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that paperwork, however necessary, was not the same as healing and should not be treated as such. She went there twice before Christmas. Once, with Stephanie, to walk through the property with the attorney handling the estate inventory. Once alone, on a Tuesday morning, when the first real snow of the season had made the drive from Silver Ridge take 40 minutes longer than it should have. She stood at the gate the second time. The iron gate with the 2 scrolls that didn't match, the left one slightly higher. She stood there long enough that Edward Harris, who had been the estate groundskeeper for 31 years, and who had answered every single question she had about every single thing on the property, without once making her feel foolish, for not already knowing, came out to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. He was good at that, at being present without filling the presence with noise. I thought it would feel like coming home, Laura said. Does it? She looked at the gate, at the fountain beyond it, the lily pads dormant now under the first skim of cold, at the house itself vast and stone, and carefully maintained by people who'd never stopped believing this moment would eventually arrive. It feels like a museum of someone I was on my way to becoming, she said. Before, Edward considered that. Maybe that's not the worst thing, he said. Museums keep things safe until you're ready for them. She went inside. She walked every room. She let herself feel whatever each room had to offer without trying to organize it into narrative. The kitchen where she'd eaten breakfast as a child. The library where her father had worked with the door open because he liked the sound of the house around him. The music room, last, always last, because the music room had the Steinway that hadn't been touched in 20 years and still held its tuning. In a way that seemed almost deliberate, as if the instrument had been waiting rather than simply surviving. She sat at the bench, put her hands on the keys. Her hands knew. Not everything. Not the difficult passages, not the years of practice she'd missed, not the refinements that only came from repetition across time, but the basic vocabulary of it, the language her mother had spent years installing in her fingers when she was too young to understand what was being given to her that was still there, under everything. Waiting with the particular patience of things that have been loved carefully. She played for 40 minutes, alone in the empty house, with the snow coming down outside. and Edward somewhere on the property giving her space without being asked. She made mistakes. Stopped, started again, made different mistakes. The instrument was generous with her imperfection. When she stopped, she sat for a while, with her hands in her lap, and thought about Jennifer Harlow, about the woman who had played this same instrument in this same room, who had noticed something wrong in the architecture of her husband's company, and had tried to document it, and had not had enough time, about the letter in the safety deposit box, written in careful longhand, the handwriting of someone who was organized about her grief, about the last line, "You are the person I chose to become. Not the person I raised, not the person I made, the person I chose, the verb of it, the agency embedded in it." Laura chose to convert the estate to a non-profit trust in January, kept a private apartment on the east wing, smaller rooms, the ones she actually recognized from early childhood. The rest became the museum she'd intuited it. Already was open to the public on weekends, proceeds supporting the foundation. She hired Margaret Flynn, the estate manager who'd kept the property functioning through the Wilson years. With a combination of professional dedication and quiet subversion, Margaret had been redirecting small amounts of the maintenance budget for years to keep Ronald's personal files intact in the lower library, a decision she'd made unilaterally and never documented, on the theory that if she was wrong about Wilson, nothing would come of it, and if she was right, someone would eventually need those files. She'd been right. Someone had needed them, and Margaret Flynn got a title and a salary, and the respect she'd been operating without for a decade. The foundation itself took shape faster than Laura expected, because Brian knew how to incorporate a non-profit, and Stephanie knew everyone in Denver who mattered to the kind of work it was going to do, and Sandra, who had started treating the foundation's organizational challenges as a practical extension of her coursework, with an enthusiasm that her actual professors found either inspiring or alarming depending on their disposition, had produced a 40-page operational plan that was better than 3 similar documents Stephanie had seen from established organizations. Thine Stanton from Ostaman established, she's going to be terrifying when she graduates. Stephanie told Laura over the phone in December. She's already terrifying, Laura said. She's just polite about it. The property outside Colorado Springs had been identified by Laura in October, the week after the Capitol steps. A converted warehouse on the edge of a small town, close enough to a hospital for practicality, far enough from the city that the mountains were visible from every window. She'd driven past it on a back road between Silver Ridge and Denver that she'd started taking because it was quieter, and she'd pulled over and looked at it for a long time. It became the Vivian Harlow Foundation Recovery Center. Not Nora. Not Laura. Vivienne, because Vivienne was the girl who had been taken, and naming the center after felt like insisting on her existence in the historical record. Regardless of what anyone had tried to do about it, the first families arrived in February. The trial of Margaret Wilson and her co-defendants began in March and was expected to last through the summer. Laura attended the first day and the last day. Stephanie attended most of it, taking careful notes. Brian managed the legal coordination from his office, appearing in court when his testimony was required. Sandra followed the proceedings through the public record, with the methodical attention of someone who intended to understand every procedural detail, which Laura suspected was both genuine interest and an extremely effective way of studying for her evidence course simultaneously. The Meridian Capital component took longer. 3 men in their 60s who had made a great deal of money by creating a financial structure that required a 19-year-old woman to disappear. They had not touched her directly. They had not made the call or mixed the drug or operated the facility. They had simply made the calculation, written the agreement, and deposited the returns. The law had to find them through a different door. And finding them through that door took longer. But it found them. The thallium evidence in Jennifer Harlow's case from tissue samples that had been preserved in the estate's medical file archive. Because Ronald Harlow had preserved everything related to his wife's illness with a thoroughness that looked in retrospect, like a man who had sensed something wrong and not known what to do with the sensing, was insufficient for criminal charges. The medical examiner's report was careful and specific about that. Insufficient for criminal charges, not insufficient for the historical record, which was where Laura had decided to put it, in a foundation report, documented, attributed, preserved. Her mother had known, had tried to act, had run out of time. The report named Jennifer Harlow as the first person to identify what Wilson was doing, and named her death as suspicious under evidence standards that fell short of legal proof. It named her by her full name, with her birth year, and her training, and her chosen instrument, and the specific piece she'd been going on in the winter of 2003, which was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, which her daughter now played every time she visited the Aspen estate. Because was the piece she remembered most clearly from childhood mornings, and because playing it felt like a conversation that had been interrupted and was now continuing. Some things couldn't be prosecuted. They could still be witnessed. The sentencing came in June. Laura drove to Denver alone. Not because she needed to be alone, she could have asked anyone, and anyone would have come, but because she wanted to walk into that courtroom as herself, singularly, without the protective architecture of other people's presence around her, and she wanted to know that she could do that. She could. She sat in the third row, behind the gallery railing, and watched Margaret Wilson be brought in. Wilson had maintained her composure through 6 months of trial, with the determination of someone who had built her entire identity on never being seen to lose. The composure was still there. It was thinner, it covered less than it used to. Judge Patricia Vance was 61 years old, and had been on the federal bench for 14 years, and had the specific quality of all excellent judges, which was that she was impossible to read until she was ready to be read. She was ready at 2:15 in the afternoon. 45 years. Federal sentencing on kidnapping, false imprisonment, conspiracy to commit estate fraud, and facilitation of unlawful detention in 3 additional documented cases. The guidelines were specific. The judge was precise. The number landed in the room with the weight of all the years it represented. Laura had prepared her victim impact statement carefully. She'd written 4 drafts. Stephanie had offered to review it. Sandra had offered to review it. She'd thanked them both and kept the final version to herself, because the final version was not for anyone's approval but her own. She stood at the podium without her notes. She'd memorized it not because she was performing, but because she'd found in the process of memorizing it that she agreed with every word. And agreement didn't require a script. "I'm not going to tell this court what was done to me," she said. Her voice in the courtroom was different than she expected, fuller, more resonant. The acoustics of the room doing something, with her words that made them feel more substantial than they had on the page. "This court knows what was done to me. The record contains it in more detail than I can access from my own memory, which is one of the stranger aspects of this situation, that strangers documented my life more completely than I was permitted to experience it." She paused, not for effect, because the next part required its own space. "I want to say something about the other people. Stephen Morrow, Patricia Cole, James Whitfield. They came after me. They were not accidents or exceptions. They were a method, and they were found because I happened to end up on the right highway on the right night. And a man I had never met decided to stop his truck." Another pause, shorter. "I am not interested in this court understanding my suffering. I'm interested in this court understanding that what was done to me was a practice, something rehearsed and refined and applied, and the sentence you assign today is the only thing that decides whether it gets applied again." She stopped there, sat down. Wilson looked at her from the defendant's table, the same look she'd deployed in every contested room for 40 years. The look that said, "I see you, I'm assessing you, I'm deciding how to use you." And Laura looked back and understood, possibly for the first time with complete clarity, that the look was the tell. It was the evidence that a person who looked at other people and saw only their utility was going to keep looking at people that way regardless of what happened in this room, And the sentence wasn't going to change the looking. It was just going to change the reach. "You've never once seen a person when you looked at someone," Laura said, quietly enough that only Wilson and the nearest court officer heard it. "That's not a criminal charge, but it's the truest thing I could say to you." Wilson's expression didn't change, but something behind it did, some final piece of architecture that had been holding a certain shape for a very long time. The sentencing was recorded and done by 3 o'clock. Laura walked out into June sunlight, which was nothing like October rain, and everything like the opposite of it, warm and available and indiscriminate, falling on everyone equally without asking what they deserved. She sat on the courthouse steps for a while. Didn't call anyone. Just sat with the afternoon. Then she got in her car and drove back to Silver Ridge. The kitchen at the end of Maple Street in July smelled like butter and something browning and a disagreement. Specifically, the disagreement was about vanilla. It had started as a question, does the hot chocolate need vanilla, and had escalated, as disagreements in this kitchen tended to escalate, into something larger and more philosophical and significantly funnier than either party would admit. "It doesn't need it," Laura said, standing at the stove with her back to the room, adding chocolate to warm milk, with the specific confidence of someone who had been doing this long enough that it had become the physical expression of something she knew deeply. "The chocolate is the point. You add vanilla, and you're saying the chocolate isn't enough." "I'm saying the chocolate is great, and also vanilla exists," Sandra said. She was at the table with her laptop open, and her summer coursework, technically in progress, in the way that summer coursework was in progress, when something more interesting was happening in the same room. These aren't mutually exclusive positions. They are when one of them is wrong. That's Sandra looked at the ceiling, at the middle distance, at the laptop. Back. That's not how positions work. Sure it is. Name one other situation where having more of a good thing makes the thing worse. Laura considered this, genuinely. The wooden spoon moving in the saucepan with its own rhythm. Every song that goes on 2 minutes too long. Sandra opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "That's actually okay, that's a point." "Thank you, still not conceding on the vanilla." "You don't have to concede, you just have to drink what I make." The back door opened. Mark came in from the garage with sawdust on his forearms, and an expression that said he'd heard at least part of this exchange from outside, and had considered his entrance timing carefully. He looked at the stove, looked at his daughter, looked at the space between them that had a particular quality to it, the comfortable friction of two people who liked each other enough to disagree, without it meaning anything. "Vanilla," he said. "Laura's wrong about it," Sandra said. "Historically the stove wins," Mark said. "That's not a principle. It is in this house." Sandra made a sound that was technically not a concession, and functionally identical to one. She went back to her laptop, with the dignity of someone who has made a strategic retreat, and is calling it something else. Laura poured 3 mugs, set them on the counter. Mark reached past her to get his, and in the reaching past, his hand briefly covered hers on the handle, which neither of them commented on, because they had arrived at the stage of things where some contact happened and was absorbed into the fabric of ordinary afternoon without requiring narration, which was not nothing, which was, in fact, the kind of thing that took considerable time and care, and a series of conversations that had happened mostly on the back porch at night, over a period of months to arrive at. The porch had become their place for the real conversations, not the logistical ones. Those happened at the kitchen table, among people, the ones about what things meant. Those happened outside, when the house was quiet and the mountains were doing what Colorado mountains did in every season, which was exist at a scale that made most personal problems feel appropriately sized. In November, he'd asked her if she was going to be all right. Genuinely asked. Not the social form of the question, the actual question. She'd thought about it for a while before answering. "I'm going to be something," she'd said. "Whether all right is the right word for it, I genuinely don't know yet, but I'm going to be present for the finding out." That's different from how I was living before. In January, he'd told her about the list. The one in the kitchen, with Maria's handwriting transitioning into his. She'd asked to see it. He'd shown her. She'd read through it without comment. Until she reached the bottom, and then she'd found a pen and written one item at the end, in her own handwriting, and handed it back. He'd read it, figure out what comes next. Properly, he'd looked at her. She'd looked at him. And then they'd had the conversation that the back porch had been waiting for. It had not been a simple conversation. It had been long and honest and occasionally uncomfortable in the way that honest things are occasionally uncomfortable. And it had not resolved everything, because the things between them were large enough that resolution was a process rather than a moment. But it had been real. It had said things that were true rather than convenient. And at the end of it, standing in the cold, with the stars doing their Colorado thing, she had put her hand in his and left it there, which was not a conclusion, but was the beginning of one. Sandra left for her second year at the end of August. She packed on a Sunday morning with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this before, and had no patience for nostalgia about it. She did not leave anything behind on purpose. She took everything that was hers, organized her room with a thoroughness that her father found both impressive and slightly pointed, and stood in the kitchen with her keys in her hand at 10 in the morning, looking at the two of them with the expression of someone concluding a calculation. "So," she said, "you're going to be okay." "We were okay before you got here," Mark said. "Debatable." She picked up her bag, set it down again, picked it up again. Laura was at the counter with her coffee. "Sandra, you're going to take care of the house when I'm gone. Your father lives in the house. Dad takes care of the structure. Someone needs to take care of the house." Sandra's expression was entirely serious. "Water the plant in the hallway. Don't let him eat cereal for dinner more than twice a week. And the hiked-up third stair, don't let him get used to it. He needs to fix it before someone falls." "I do not eat cereal for dinner," Mark said. They both looked at him. "More than twice a week," he amended. Sandra gave a single satisfied nod. Hugged her father, long and complete. Hugged Laura, which happened with the easy certainty of something that had been true for a while. Then she walked out the front door and drove away. And the house was quiet in a different way than it had been before she arrived for the summer. Not empty. Settled. Laura stood at the kitchen window for a while with her coffee. Mark stood next to her. The street outside was ordinary. A neighbor's sprinkler, a dog moving with intention somewhere. The September light doing its Colorado thing, golden and serious, not warm exactly, but honest. "She told me something in July," Laura said. "She tells everyone things in July. It's her month," she said. Laura paused. Finding the exact words mattered to her in the way that finding exact words matters to people who spent years without access to their own. She said that she was glad I was here. Not glad for reasons. Just glad. "Yeah. I didn't know what to do with that for a week." "What did you do with it eventually?" She considered. "I decided to believe it." Mark looked at his coffee mug, looked at the window, at the street that was just a street on ordinary morning in September, with his daughter, with gone back to school, and the house around them, with its particular texture and its particular weight and its particular warmth. "Sounds right," he said. She turned from the window. He turned from the window, and they looked at each other in the way of two people who had arrived somewhere neither of them had been aiming for and had found it was the right place anyway. The Foundation Center in Colorado Springs held its first community event in October. Not a ribbon cutting. Laura had been specifically against ribbon cuttings, on the grounds that they performed significance, rather than creating it. Instead, a dinner, long tables, food that required passing things and asking questions about who wanted more. Families who had found each other again after years of not finding each other. Staff who had been carefully selected for their understanding that recovery was not linear, and that a place that housed people in the aftermath of rupture needed to feel like a place rather than a program. Stephen Morrow was there with his sister, who had driven from Flagstaff and who cried in the parking lot before coming inside, and then came inside and talked to everyone with the particular warmth of someone who had been very frightened for a very long time, and was now in the first days of not being frightened anymore. Stephen himself was quieter than his sister, still finding his conversational footing after 8 years of being denied the ordinary practice of it. But he was there, physically present, choosing what he ate and where he sat and who he spoke to. He sat next to Laura at dinner. "I didn't know what I expected this place to feel like," he said. "What does it feel like?" He thought about it, the way he thought about most things, slowly, carefully, with the deliberateness of someone who had relearned that his thoughts were worth taking seriously. Like somewhere that was built by someone who knew what we needed without needing to explain what we needed, he said. Laura looked at the tables, the food, the families, the staff moving through the room with the attentiveness of people who understood that what they were doing mattered. "I had a lot of time to think about what it should be," she said. "Yeah." He looked at his plate, then at her. "Thank you, for the obvious thing. But also for this, the not disappearing after. That's the part no one prepares you for. Everyone shows up for the rescue. It's after the rescue that gets quiet." She knew exactly what he meant. She'd lived the after. "That's what this is for," she said. The dinner went late. Carol had driven down from Silver Ridge with Ruth and Patricia, 2 women from her retired social workers group, who had spent their careers trying to find people who'd gone missing and who had arrived with the specific energy of women who had never fully retired in the ways that mattered. They occupied one end of a table and generated an amount of warmth and organized opinion that raised the temperature of the room by several perceptible degrees. Mark was somewhere in the middle section of the room, talking to a man he'd just met, the husband of a survivor, someone who'd spent 5 years not knowing, and was now in the first stages of having his wife back in the specific complicated form that having someone back takes. Mark was listening more than talking. He was good at that. It was one of the first things she'd understood about him, that he had learned somewhere, from some combination of loss and service and the particular education of being a father alone. That listening was not the pause before speaking, but its own complete act. She watched him for a moment from across the room. He was leaning slightly forward, elbows on the table, the way he did when he was paying full attention. The man across from him was saying something with his hands. Mark nodded once, then said something short, whatever it was, and the man's posture changed, not dramatically, but perceptibly, something releasing. Brian appeared at Laura's elbow with a glass of water and an expression of carefully managed professional equanimity. "The Meridian Capital sentencing is Thursday." "I know. You don't have to attend." "I know that too. Are you going to?" she thought. About it. About the 3 men in their 60s who had done their work through financial instruments and never touched anything directly. About the way the law had found them, and the way the law's finding of them did not undo the mechanism they'd helped build, only interrupted it. "No," she said. "Stephanie can represent the foundation. I have a dinner to finish." Brian looked around the room, the long tables, the noise level of people who had things to say to each other that they'd been keeping inside for years. "You did something real here. We did something real here." She looked at him directly. "Don't minimize yourself. You filed 11 motions in 40 days. 12 motions. The 3rd one was actually redundant, but I filed it for completeness. I know. I read them." He looked slightly startled. "All of them?" "I had 20 years of not knowing what was happening to me," she said. "I don't intend to spend the next 20 years not knowing what's happening around me." October settled into November. The mountains shifted color, the way they did not gradually, all at once, like a decision. The aspens went gold overnight and stayed gold for exactly as long as the weather permitted, and then went bare in the deliberate way, keeping nothing that wasn't necessary. Niece? Laura drove the back road between Silver Ridge and Colorado Springs twice a week for the foundation. She had hired an executive director, a woman named Barbara Moore, who had 20 years in nonprofits and the specific gift of organizational intelligence, the ability to make things work without making the working visible, and she had given Barbara the authority and the budget to run the operation properly, while Laura served as board chair and stayed available for the conversations that required her specifically. It was a balance she was still learning, the balance between presence and withdrawal, between the foundation being hers, in a meaningful sense, and it being larger than her, in the equally meaningful sense that made it worth building. She talked about it with Dr. Elena Kim on Thursday mornings. Dr. Kim was in Denver and their sessions were in person, which Laura preferred because she'd had enough of rooms mediated by screens and distance. Dr. Kim was careful and specific, and had a way of asking questions that suggested she already knew the answer, but understood that Laura needed to arrive at it by herself to own it. "What do you want?" Dr. Kim asked in November. Plainly, not what do you want for the foundation, not what do you want professionally, just what do you want? Laura looked at the window in Dr. Kim's office. Bare trees outside, silver-gray sky, the particular neutral tone of a November Thursday. "I want to stop checking whether I'm allowed to want things," she said. "I want to just want them. Are you close?" Closer than I was. She thought about the kitchen in Silver Ridge. The specific argument about vanilla that had happened approximately 7 times and showed no signs of resolving. The way Sandra texted her from Denver about coursework and about television shows in the same message, as if both categories of information belonged in the same place. The back porch in the evenings, when the temperature had dropped enough to require a coat, but not enough to make it unpleasant to be outside. When Mark sat beside her with his coffee, and sometimes talked and sometimes didn't, and both conditions were equally fine. Much closer, she said. On a Tuesday evening in December, the first real snow of winter came down on Silver Ridge. With the same commitment, it always did, not a suggestion, not a possibility, but a declaration. The town disappeared under it. The street outside the house went white and quiet and clean in the way that snow made things clean, which was temporary and complete while it lasted. Laura stood at the kitchen stove, milk, dark chocolate, cinnamon, the ritual of it, which she had by now performed often enough, that it had become fully hers rather than something borrowed from a memory she couldn't completely locate. She had concluded, allowed to own things that she'd learned from her mother, and things that she'd learned here, and things she'd developed on her own in the 20 years in between, which had not been entirely empty of her own selfhood. No matter how hard someone had tried to make them so, you did not stop being yourself, because someone needed you not to be. You became less visible, but you persisted. The kitchen was warm, and a little cluttered in the way. It was always a little cluttered, which was something she had stopped trying to fix because the clutter was alive, and the absence of it would mean the absence of the people who generated it. Mark came downstairs. He'd changed out of his work clothes and into the flannel and jeans that were his default state of being at home, and he had the unhurried quality of someone who had decided that this evening specifically was not going to require him to do anything beyond exist in it. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her at the stove with the 3 mugs already set out. "Sandra," he said, "called an hour ago. She's staying in Denver through the weekend. Her study group has a final on Monday, so it's just us. He came into the kitchen, got his mug from the counter before she'd poured it, which was something he had started doing, and which she had registered without comment as a small gesture of comfort, the kind of small gesture that people make when they have decided to be comfortable in a place. She poured. He took his mug to the table, which was cleared tonight. No files, no laptops, just the table's surface in the lamplight. She brought hers and sat across from him. Outside, the snow was still coming down, quiet and steady. The kind of snow that wasn't going anywhere quickly. "Brian called," Mark said. "I know. I'll deal with it tomorrow. Not urgent?" "It's always something with the estate trust. It'll wait until morning." She held her mug in both hands. The warmth of it through the ceramic, the particular warmth that she had missed without knowing she missed it, that she had practiced back into existence in a stranger's kitchen on a night that kept feeling further away and more important simultaneously. "Stephanie thinks the Morrow civil case settles by spring." "Good. It's not it won't undo anything, but it's accountability. Sometimes his accountability is the whole point." She looked at him, at the directness of that, The way he said things simply without stripping them of weight. You know, you do that very well. Do what? Say things that are true without making a whole thing of them. He considered that. Maria used to say I was economical with language. She was right. She was right about most things. He turned his mug in his hands. There's something you should know. I added to the list. She looked up. The list. The kitchen notepad. The one she'd looked at in January and added her own line to. The one that had started with Maria's handwriting and become something shared across time and absence. Can I read it? She asked. He went to the counter, came back with the notepad, set it on the table and slid it across to her. She read from where her own handwriting started. Her line, figure out what comes next, properly. Then below it, in his handwriting, added sometime in the last months, fix the third stair. A week later, same pen, let someone help with the paint. And at the very bottom, most recently, in handwriting that was slightly more deliberate than the rest, the way handwriting gets. When someone has thought about a thing before, committing it to paper, stop being careful about wanting things. She read it twice. Then she set the notepad down on the table between them and left her hand on it. That's mine too, she said. Yeah. He put his hand over hers on the notepad. I know. Outside the snow kept coming. Silver Ridge kept doing what small mountain towns do in December, which was hold on, keep the lights on. Stay warm inside while the cold organized itself outside. Wait for morning with the specific patience of places that had been through enough winters to know they would come through this one too. Inside the house at the end of Maple Street, in the kitchen with its particular warmth and its particular clutter, and its 3 mugs set out by habit, even when only 2 were needed. 2 people sat at a table, with their hands overlapping on a notepad, that had started as one woman's way of fighting grief, and had become something else over time, a record of persistence, of staying, of the way life kept adding items, even when you thought you were at the bottom of the list. Laura thought about the highway in October, the rain, the headlights, the moment of being seen before. She could explain herself, or defend herself, or prepare the version of herself she would have wanted to present if she'd had a choice. She hadn't had a choice. That was the thing she'd spent the most time with, in Dr. Kim's office, in the Foundation Center, on the back porch in every season. The difference between the things that had been done to her without her choice, and the things she was choosing now. The difference was everything. The difference was the whole of what had been taken, and the whole of what was being rebuilt, one ordinary evening at a time, with the snow coming down outside, and the chocolate going cold in her mug, because she'd stopped drinking it to look at a list of things 2 people were giving themselves permission to want. She was not the woman on the highway anymore. She was also not the 19-year-old in the photograph at the iron gates. She was not the patient in the white room, or the missing person in the old newsprint, or the Harlow air that the legal system was still processing through its various corridors. She was the woman in this kitchen. She was here, which was not a small thing, which was not a given, which was the thing that everything else had been in service of, and which she intended to treat, from this point forward, with the seriousness it deserved. Mark picked up his mug, drank, set it down the stair, he said. What? The third one. Sandra told you to tell me to fix it. She told me not to let you get used to it. I'm going to fix it Saturday. I'll believe that when I see it. You'll see it. There are 4 other things on the list that predate the stair. The stair is a safety issue. The paint is structural. The paint is aesthetic. In a Colorado winter, paint is fine. He held up his free hand. The stair and the paint. Saturday. And the hallway light. The hallway light has been on the list since Maria wrote it, she said. I know. Which is why it's still on the list. She looked at him. Finishing things that were started by people we lost is from forgetting them, is different from forgetting them. It's the opposite of forgetting them. He was quiet for a moment. Saturday, he said. Stair, paint, hallway light. I'll make lunch. You don't have to, she said, clearly. Without the pause she would have put between the sentence and itself 6 months ago, the small hesitation of someone checking whether they were permitted. I want to make lunch on Saturday while you fix things. That's what I want. The snow outside was deep enough, now that the street had disappeared completely into white. No cars, no movement. Just the white and the lamplight and the quiet that snow made when it meant it. Mark looked at her across the table, with the notepad between their hands, and the 3 mugs and the kinch that had started this whole thing, without knowing it was starting anything, and he said what was true, which was all he'd ever really known how to do, good, and it was.